Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar. I wish I could see all of you. We really sincerely hope that you and yours are healthy and faring as well as you can right now. I am Sarah Milligan-Toffler, the Executive Director of the Children in Nature Network, and I'm joining you all today from my home office, which is located on the ancestral territory of the Dakota people. My sidekick here, over there, who really needs no introduction, is Richard Louv, who I think most of you know is the co-founder of the Children in Nature Network and author of many books, including Last Child in the Woods, which was such an instrumental book for this movement, the Children in Nature movement. I'll just say that for me, coming together like this with colleagues and friends to share ideas and solve problems is really what's giving me hope right now. So I really want to thank you for your time and your energy and being with us today. Both Rich and I have been so inspired by the creativity and the resiliency of the Children in Nature movement, of all of you through this crisis. COVID-19 is really impacting all of us in huge ways. Our daily lives and ways in which we do our work have been unimaginably disrupted. I think all of us on this call know that nature can and is providing a reprieve, a respite from all of the stress and uncertainty. I know it is for me. But right now, the inequities in access to nature and in all aspects of life are more apparent and more harmful than ever. So I've been asking myself, and our team has been asking ourselves, how can our movement come together to keep kids and families, especially the most vulnerable, mentally and physically healthy during this crisis? How can we help people connect safely to nature in the time of physical and social distancing, right? Parks are closed, shelter-in-place restrictions. What does connection to nature look like at this time? Rich and I are just going to share some of our ideas that we've been hearing, but also want to hear from you. We really want this to be as interactive as possible, even though right now it's kind of a one-way picture. But we hope that you'll share your ideas and thoughts in the chat about the biggest challenges, the creative solutions, or that you or others are employing that we can be sharing out through our networks. We really want to know, how can the Children in Nature Network best support you at this time? This is always true. We know we're all connected, but we really are all in this together, and it's more important than ever to support each other as we figure out how to connect to nature and to each other during this pandemic and hopefully beyond. So in that spirit, let's get started. Just very briefly, our agenda for today is very simple. We're going to start with a conversation between Rich and me. We're going to share some of what we've been hearing. And again, please use the webinar's chat to share your thoughts, resources, and ideas as we talk. We'll follow that with a conversation with you, Q&A. You can post your questions in the audience icon up at the top of the webinar page. And that's, if you post them there for Rich and me, we will do our best to answer as many questions as we possibly can. And we will be sending out a survey after the webinar is over, and really ask you to please watch for that and send us your ideas and feedback. That will help us out a lot. I also want to make sure very briefly that you're all aware of the new site we launched last week called FindingNature, or at FindingNature.org. FindingNature.org. Over the past few weeks, we've been receiving a lot of questions and requests. Really an unprecedented amount. For information from partners and leaders in our network, many of you. And given the clear need for information really right now, we launched the FindingNature.org site to highlight some of the best resources and creative problem solving coming from trusted sources across our movement. We hope this serves as a place for you to come for ideas, to share ideas, and as a virtual gathering place for online meetings and events like this one, and until we hopefully will be able to gather in person again at some point in the future. I'd also encourage you to use the Finding Nature hashtag as a way to help aggregate all of your great ideas and resources being shared on social right now. That'll allow us to help kind of share out your ideas and hopefully get more eyeballs on all of your great work. We'll be adding new resources each week to the site. And again, you can add suggestions in the webinar's audience question box today of additional resources that should be in there. Or at any time, you can email us at info@childrenandnature.org with your thoughts and ideas. And again, we're particularly looking for resources that address the lack of equitable access to nature. And we know these inequities have always existed, but especially right now, we know that not everyone has access to safe nearby parks or green space, or even if those are nearby, that people may not be able to access them. So we're looking for great ideas from you on how you're addressing that in your communities and what you're hearing from folks that you work with. I did want to just flag that we have our great partners at Tinkergarten are providing resources for how to bring the outdoors inside during this time, and you can find those resources in the resource section of the FindingNature.org site. So this is the first in our new Finding Nature webinar series, and I hope you'll be able to join us for our next one, which is scheduled for Tuesday, May 5th, that will look at nature's role in building resilience and supporting mental health. And you can register in the events section of the FindingNature.org site. So just very briefly, I want to let you all know who's on today's webinar. We are so delighted to have people attending from all over the United States and at least 13 nations around the world, including Israel, Germany, Canada, Scotland, Denmark, Australia, New Zealand, Uruguay, United Kingdom, Mexico, Sweden, Spain, and Turkey. So thank you all for our international folks on the call. Please share in the chat good ideas that are coming from your community so we all can learn from what you all are doing. We have folks from many sectors also on today's call, which is great to see. We have formal educators from preschool through college, formal and informal environmental educators, direct service program providers, folks working in municipal government, public health, and health care, outdoor recreation providers, youth development professionals, zoo and aquarium professionals, grassroots leaders of all ages, parents, and caregivers. Please let us know in the chat if you represent a sector that I didn't mention there. And so as we start our conversation, Rich and I are going to try and hit on content that speaks to the many things we've been hearing, our challenges across all these sectors. So we hope that we hit on pieces that are relevant to you, and that you certainly during the Q&A be sure to bring forward your questions and ideas. Okay, well, with that, Rich, are you ready to get started?
Yeah.
All righty. I think I'm going to just start with a question about, mental health at this time. I mean, we know from the research how important nature connection is for our health, both, our physical and mental health. But this pandemic raises questions in both areas, but perhaps, really especially around our mental health. I'm wondering what thoughts you have about nature's role in supporting good mental health, both now and as we come out of this crisis.
Well, I wrote a piece, REI, who's been a big supporter of the Children Nature Network and the Children Nature movement, asked me to write a piece that they published yesterday, I think, on their journal. And the title of it is Finding Nature and Finding Each Other. That nature has this power to help us find each other and to find some solace. And the story at the beginning of the piece is about Sarah Walker, who was a college student in Ontario when she wrote a piece for us several years ago. She was also a Children Nature Network natural leader. And she described her special place in nature, her sit spot, as John Young likes to call the place we go to that's special. And she described how she was sitting on a hill overlooking a forest that defined the landscape, really, of her favorite place in the world. And she said, today, for the first time, I can tell you with one word why I fell in love with the Children in Nature movement. It is also the same reason I sit outside in this frigid weather. And the word is security. And she continued, as I sit atop this hill, I know that no matter what life brings my way, I can sit in this spot and watch the sun rise and set below the tree line. Security. Before I read Sarah's piece, I'd never particularly connected that word with experiences in the natural world, but there it was, security. And it's true. How many of us now find ourselves standing at the edge of our yard or on a balcony or at the edge of a closed park, and we yearn for that sense of security? We can still feel it. The view of a tree line or a distant wave or a pigeon on a window ledge or a deer come past my wife's and my house now with their ears raised like antenna. And they all remind us that we're not alone in the world and that nature will find a way. I think that mental health has always been, there's more research on mental health related to our connection to nature than there is even physical health.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of research now. And one of the major health issues that precedes this period of social distancing, social isolation, or as my wife corrects me, she says physical distancing and social solidarity. And the issue of loneliness, human loneliness. There's been in recent years really an epidemic of human loneliness that the medical folks now say is about to be more of a factor in early death than obesity or smoking, that it's on par with those two at this point, and that it's increasing. Again, this precedes this period now where we're supposed to stay away from each other. It's funny how we're not staying away from each other, and I don't mean the crowds that rush into parks and downtown and all of that. I mean what we're doing right now. I never thought I'd appreciate the internet as much as I do now. But this loneliness that we've felt for a long time, that's been growing in people, we've blamed that on the internet. We blamed it on all kinds of things. But I think it is rooted in an even deeper loneliness. And in the alleged new book, I write about this quite a bit. And I say that it is rooted in a very deep species loneliness. That as a species, increasingly, we're more and more alone. We separate ourselves more and more from nature. More and more we witness nature deficit disorder, as I've called it. And as a species, we deeply don't want to be alone in the universe. One of the most interesting, or actually it's been studied several times, is the urban parks that have the greatest psychological benefit for human beings just happen to be the ones with the highest biodiversity. I don't think that's an accident.
Right.
We don't want to be alone in the universe. I mean, why else would we look for Bigfoot
Right.
or intelligent life on other planets when Stephen Hawking and others say, might not be a good idea to find that.
Right.
We need each other. And there are a lot of ways to achieve this that we've learned through the research that right now, one of the things that we can do in the movement that's most important, I think, is tell people about the research related to loneliness, to mental health, not just loneliness, but mental health, that the calming effect of gardening, of trees, of green space, that's long been known. That the studies that suggest that when we interact with animals, the neurochemicals and the hormones associated with social bonding are elevated. Nature, as it turns out, can be a civilizing force. When people have more nature in their lives, there's some evidence that bullying goes down on playgrounds. There's some evidence that domestic violence may be reduced. And as time goes on, the recognition of nature's therapeutic value, I think, is going to grow, especially after the pandemic ends and the trauma of the pandemic actually kicks in even more than it is in the coming months.
Yeah.
A few years ago, I was asked to speak in Newton, Connecticut. This was 3 months after all those children that were killed in the school shooting. And I wondered, why was I asked to go to that? And they said, well, we wanted you to talk about nature's healing qualities.
Mm.
And they said that what is known of trauma after these terrible events is that it really hits the survivors about 3 months after the event. And that's why they'd asked me to come then. And they asked other people to come too, to talk about that. I think, we're going to see not only trauma during the pandemic, but afterwards, as we re-enter, as our children re-enter schools, as we re-enter our workplaces. It'll be a little bit like the culture shock we sometimes feel when we've been out of the country, and then when we come back and we see Wolf Blitzer on every television screen in the airport. I mean, we really need to understand, I think, and tell people about just how important this healing quality of nature is, not only now, but later.
Well, and I would say, Rich, I know, I believe Children in Nature Network board member and leader in Texas, Nancy Herron, I believe she's on the call today on the webinar, and she posted something on Facebook this morning that was a feeling of frustration about all of the public health workers, the flight attendants, the people that are out there that have to go to work, the folks in healthcare, and how it feels so hard to not be able to do anything that feels useful right now. And I, just hearing you talk, what I do think that there are things that we can do now, because I will say that park directors, municipal leaders from all across the country have been reaching out to us to say, how can we add things for people to do in parks that don't involve ball fields and playground equipment, because they're trying to keep people off of those. So there's an increased, opportunity to talk about what you were saying about the need for more biodiversity in those parks, more trails, more, even in small urban parks, there can be more nature play and more opportunities and we can start advocating for that now because we're seeing the need for it, right? So, and there's a moment here where we can start to, work to move policy and planning for when this whole thing is over. So I just encourage folks to think about doing that. We do have some resources on our website and our cities hub for how to talk to your municipal leaders about that. But I think there are opportunities now for us to talk about what's the natural infrastructure that we need to put back into our cities, where people can connect to nature very, very close to home. So well, let's move on to our next question. You mentioned your book, and I know that we have a number of folks on today's webinar who represent zoos and aquariums from across the country, and we've been seeing some really creative ideas that how zoos and aquariums are pivoting. But I'm just wondering, if you could talk about, to provide online content, to be able to see, if you can't come into the zoo, you can see the animals by video and things like that, which is just really great. But I just would be curious, Rich, what you're hearing and thinking about in terms of, how animals might, support people in connecting to nature, even if they need to do that from indoors. What might that look like?
Well, zoos and aquaria have obviously been going through a lot of changes and improving greatly in the last couple decades and before. I think there's an opportunity here for zoos and aquaria to reach out far beyond their own borders. They're already doing this. I mean, Ron Swaisgood at San Diego Zoo is a friend of ours, and he talks about the great research they're doing that people don't hear about endangered species in the county of San Diego and beyond, in their own territory. But it makes me think of a story that was told to me by the Woodland Park Zoo, I think, in Seattle or Portland, I'm sorry. And the director of that zoo told me that they had a raptor escape from the zoo. And they sent out the word all over the city, I believe it was Portland, all over the city, telling people about the raptor and to look out for it, see if they could find it. And they were deluged with email back from kids and parents and schools that were all out there looking for the raptor from their windows, not only out there physically. And they started sending back reports of this raptor, and they found the raptor.
Hmm.
I think it's kind of a metaphor for how zoos and aquaria can reach even deeper into their communities and connect with people in different ways and engage them really in knowing, coming to know their own bioregion. We can do a lot from our own houses. You know, Gary Snyder, the great poet Gary Snyder, has this great line. He says, "Nature is not someplace we go, nature is home." So we can start paying attention to the life just outside our windows. Um, I just this morning I saw a great article about um, there's this kind of there's a Facebook page and it's kind of spontaneous. People are taking all over the world. This was a story in the India Times. Um, that people all over the world are taking photographs out of their windows and putting them online. And so many of those photographs are of nature. Not everybody lives in the mountains or beautiful, pastoral scene, but they're taking pictures of their window boxes. They're taking pictures of the raptor that sits on the roof across from them, in the high-rise building across from them. They're paying attention. This can happen even in the most populated neighborhoods. I mean, we can notice songbirds and other animals in ways that we've never known or took for granted. We can create sit spots in our own yards or even next to the window. A few years ago, I visited the head of a major conservation organization in Washington, D.C., and his son had a condition where he literally couldn't go outdoors. He was a teenager, and he loved nature. Um, and so on the way back home, on the layover in Denver, I found this book in the bookstore. It was the Cloud Spotters textbook, I think is the name of it. It's a British book. And it was all about all the different kinds of clouds and how to look for them and keep a cloud journal and all that. And I sent it to his son. There's so much we can do from our windows. We can watch stars from our windows, even if we can't go outside. And as I say, we can identify birds. We can be involved in, say, the Cornell Bird Watch, even from our window, from our yard.
Right.
And then there's this other thing we can do. In addition to observing and paying attention, in Our Wild Calling, I talk about what I call the reciprocity principle. And basically, we need to give back to nature as much or preferably even more than it gives us. For every acre that we take for our own habitation, we can preserve or create another acre or more, preferably more. But we can do this in our own yards. We can send for mail order seeds to plant a pollinator garden for butterflies to help bring back the butterfly migration routes. We can do that right now. The entomologist Doug Ptolemy, who's a friend who has a great book out now called Nature's Last Hope, or Nature's Best Hope, that we can help create a homegrown national park by replacing part or all of our lawns with native species. And when we do that, my wife and I did that, when we do that, we see insects and native wildlife come back home to where we live, right next to our house. That's another thing. So we can not only observe nature, we can nurture nature. That's
Right.
something really positive we can do right now.
Yeah. I know that we have somebody on the webinar today from Uruguay. He's the guy that emailed you, Rich, with the meditation that you can do inside holding a natural object. So, Julian, I hope you'll share the link to your to the exercise that you created and share that with folks on the webinar. And just want to remind folks that you can certainly post ideas and questions using that dialogue icon at the top of the webinar page.
And your ideas, your questions are great, but we're really trying to collect as many ideas and give credit to the people who give us those ideas, so we can share those with people all over the world.
Yeah, it's a great point, Rich. And I should mention too that you can find the link that I just referred to on FindingNature.org along with some other stuff. So please check that out. We have many educators, as I mentioned, of all kinds, environmental educators, K through 12, post K-12 educators on the webinar today. And, I just going to guess that many, if not all of these folks have been advocating for and providing outdoor education for years, right? Now we kind of are seeing that every parent in America around the world has become a homeschool parent, and around the world, really, not just in the United States. And, at least on my Facebook feeds, seeing that people can't wait to get their kids out of the house if they can. I'm just wondering what thoughts you have about ensuring that the understanding of importance of spending time outdoors and for supporting, outdoor education isn't lost once this crisis has passed. How do we sort of um, make sure that we don't, sort of miss this moment in terms of the understanding of the importance of nature, um, for in the education system.
Well, one thing that is happening now is that teachers are busy. They're online. They're very engaged with their students to the extent they can be. One of the unintended consequences of the pandemic is suddenly parents are talking about paying teachers more because they got after one day of homeschooling, they think teachers should be paid $1 million a year per teacher. May be a little bit above the budget, but not a bad idea. There's been a shift to online learning. I think one of the things that can be done is to emphasize what we've talked a lot about, Sarah, and the people in the movement have of natural learning areas. There's been a big growth of natural play spaces and natural learning areas at schools, a big growth in nature-based preschools in the last few years, but that the land right next to the house is also a natural play space or a natural learning area that parents can use. It's a great way to get out of the house too, is to go out and do the lesson plan outdoors and learn about science and nature. But not only that, to read outdoors. The research shows that cognitive functioning improves when we learn outdoors. Not all kids, but most kids, there is that improvement in cognitive function that's been linked to learning outdoors. Uh, uh, so that's obviously one thing that can happen. It can also take this moment to begin to uh, think about how can we change the schools when the pandemic is over.
Right.
There's one of the remarkable things recently has been the huge increase in interest in nature. It's like you don't know what you've got until it's gone. And now everybody's talking about it. I can't tell you. Well, you've already seen all of these articles about the hunger that people feel. And I think that hunger is going to grow over time. And so we can use that hunger, not use it, but we can build on that hunger to think about what the world is going to be like after the pandemic and how it can be better.
Yeah, no, I agree.
By the way, Jared just wrote in. He says, I've been doing a daily interactive Mr. Rogers style nature show with gratitude, simple crafts, sit spots, and more that young kids and their parents can do without leaving the yard. That's great. Thanks, Jared.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. I also want to point out that North American Association for Environmental Education, NAAE.org, has great resources for outdoor learning, as does Green Schoolyards America. So I encourage you to check out those resources too if you haven't already.
And Jared, by the way, has a great blog on Finding Nature in the FindingNature.org spot.
That's great.
About his ideas.
That's great. Okay, I think I'm going to do one more question and then we'll open it up for questions from folks that are joining us here today. So be thinking of your questions and posting them in that audience Q&A section so that we'll have some good questions. I think what you just mentioned, this, that people are discovering right now how important nature is to them. We're not having to sell that concept right now. When you sort of strip away everything else, people are finding that desire to connect. Just wondering, as a movement, what does it look like, when we go back to whatever the new normal looks like? How do we not lose the starring role that nature is playing right now? When the distractions come back in and it becomes easy to sort of forget the need for that. Just wondering what thoughts or ideas you've been having about how we can take make sure that we understand this moment and for this movement, and how do we not have us go back to where we were?
I've been thinking about something that may or may not happen, but I hope it happens. It's kind of a slingshot effect, which
Okay.
I think of it as, which is that all those great programs out there that directly connect kids to nature and families and communities, the great work being done by the National League of Cities and Children Nature Network to change cities in the future to be more filled with opportunities to connect to nature. And the nature centers, all of those programs that have been doing such great work, because of budgets, because of not being able to go out in the parks and all of that, there's going to be a pullback, and it's going to be painful. It's already painful.
Yeah.
A pullback in what can be offered. Now, imaginative ways are happening already about shifting that toward, obviously, talking to people about what they can do in their own backyard, their own rooftop, their own, if they're not in a place that has a yard, they can have a window box, they can do all of those things. After that pullback, it's like a slingshot. That power of nature will grow in people's mind. And when we come back to a connection to the outdoors, to the outdoor world beyond our sequesters' houses, I think that power is going to be even greater than it is now. It'll gather strength and we'll let the slingshot go. And then there's going to be a huge, even greater hunger and understanding about nature at that point. So starting now, we can start to think of ways that we can make sure that all children and adults, not just the kids of parents who love nature, not just kids of certain races or ethnic groups or immigrant groups, and not just people with certain abilities or disabilities, but all children have a human right to the gifts of nature.
Right.
I think we need to focus on donors and funding that understand that this is a critical moment, not to let these programs fall back too far, but actually to fund future thinking, to help them work out what's going to happen, what the post-pandemic world is going to be like, and how we can make it much better than it is now.
Yeah.
Also, not only to preserve the last remaining natural spaces, conservation is no longer enough. Now we need to create nature where we live, learn, work, and play, and pray. We need more nature in urban places. We need more urban wildlife corridors and park expansions, to find the kind of biodiversity that we need. We need far more wildlands than we have now. We can create that. We can support the One Health movement in public health, which really recognizes, particularly in urban places, the interconnection of plants and humans and animals and the earth itself, that treats this as one thing rather than segregating human health aside. That's going to be particularly important in the age of pandemics to do that. We can also work to reduce global warming and biodiversity collapse, slow the destruction of natural habitats, to really build a community that's healthy for the children of all species.
Yeah.
And we can bring ourselves together in a new kind of community that includes not only other humans, but all of us, all of the family of animals and plants.
Yeah, thank you, Rich, for that. That's really, as always, we call you our inspirer in chief, and really appreciate the visionary thinking of, how can we envision better communities coming out of this. I think we'll move to the audience Q&A right now, and as folks are typing in questions, one of the things I just want to put out there to the group, I've been receiving calls and emails from groups from around the country asking the Children of Nature Network if we can help program providers kind of come together, be a neutral convener to help them solve problems together. If we might provide some, a marketing campaign that we all can kind of get behind, that works rather than everybody sort of creating their own, and just kind of this moment of maybe collective power. And I would be interested in hearing from folks on this call what you're thinking about that. Is there a role for the Children of Nature Network to play, and how can we support all of you at this time? So with that, love to hear some questions from the webinar attendees. So during this time, inequality in accessing nature is heightened. What are some suggestions we can recommend to our students that suffer from those inequalities while they are home? And this is from Michaela. Rich, do you want to take a first crack at that, or would you like me to?
Why don't you go ahead with it? I've talked too much.
Sure. No. Well, this is, thank you for asking this question, Michaela. This is on all of our minds right now. And I think I'm going to answer the question in two ways. I think that there are some things that we can do right now. And if folks do have access to the internet, and I know that's one of the inequities that we're dealing with, but if they do have access, we are sharing some of the best tools and resources for ways that people can connect to nature, even from indoors. And so you can find some of those, on FindingNatureorg, and we're connecting to, lots of other great resources from our partners and folks across our network. I think, supporting teachers in having those tools and resources. So NAAE and, some of those teaching resources are out there. You could share those with educators so that they can be building that into the curriculum that they're sharing. I think there's also ways to reach out to folks who are, providing social workers and social welfare workers, just to share resources with them. They might be reaching those families that don't have access to the internet, to share resources with them on how they can encourage people to, take care of themselves in nearby nature. But I think there's a longer term way that we need to think about this too, is to recognize that, the inequities in terms of access to green space across our cities, and start to advocate with our municipal and state government leaders about the importance of greening school grounds, of greening alleyways, of street level green space, of, when housing developments are going in. I mean, Maine Quode has done 20 plus years of research on the healthiest public housing spaces are those that have green space. And it reduces violence, it increases and improves all kinds of outcomes. And so now is the time to advocate for those policy changes long term, so that we can start to really, get to some of the systemic reasons for these inequities. So those would be just some of my initial thoughts there.
One thing that I would suggest adding to that is, not only right now, but generally before and afterwards, there's a tendency to tell people how to connect to nature from our own cultural viewpoint. And one of the mistakes that can be made is when people who look like me put on our day pack and walk into a neighborhood where people don't look like me and tell them how to connect to nature without first asking how do they connect to nature. I'm really interested, and have been for a long time, about how different cultural groups, how different immigrant groups, how different people from African American culture or Latino cultures, or what are the things that our grandparents told us about how they connected to nature? What are the stories that come down about incredible encounters with animals? This, if we're in our houses with our families, and hopefully some of the grandparents are in those houses, it's a good moment to tell stories about our connection to nature, and really to value our own culture's abilities, capacity, the natural cultural capacity is what I call that, to uh, to make that connection in unexpected ways.
Yeah.
So that's one thing I would add to that, and then share those ideas.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you, Rich. That's great. Okay. Do we have other questions? I'm having a hard time sharing the importance of getting fresh air in New York City. People are truly now terrified, or so they have shared with me, about going outside at all. Um, wow. Thank you, Jennifer, for sharing that. I think, it's understandable. I know that New York is, kind of the hot spot right now, and it's understandable why people are scared. Obviously, we've seen from around the world where people have, gone out on balconies, and I think, and it may be, advised right now that people don't go outside much. So I guess I would highlight or repeat what you just said, Rich. I mean, I think that the ways in which we can tell stories, that we can journal about our favorite spot, we can meditate, we can, as we're feeling stressed, to sort of think about those places that calm us, and to, to think about those places. I love the cloud, looking at the clouds, and trying to spot them. Um, you know, there are lots of creative ways that people can, during, hopefully not, too much longer, but, people can feel their connection to the rest of the world by, using their imaginations. I don't know. I mean, I would ask others in the chat. These are hard questions. I don't have the answers. If other ideas that people have, I hope you'll just share them with the group right now. Um,
And by the way, Jennifer Walsh, who asked that question, if it's the same Jennifer Walsh, and I suspect it is she does Walking with Walsh, is her online program. She walked with me and interviewed me at Serenbe uh, in Georgia. And she does great work. She cares deeply about this issue, and it's a painful question.
it is.
And that that thing that I read about this morning in India Times about people taking pictures of nature out of their window. There's always a way. And this morning I suggested to Sarah, and Sarah's always pleased when I come up with another new idea that we'd have to find funding to do. Is why not have a contest, even a worldwide contest of images that people record, either paintings. Kids can paint what they see out their window of nature. They can take photographs. Maybe they can write poems and really begin to see what we can see. I mean, that's the thing about nature is, you don't need Yosemite to see nature. The cliche about it, the world is in a grain of sand. It's it's right outside your window. It's in the window box. It's in, you know, the raptor that is making a nest on the ledge on the building across from you.
Yeah.
Um, Sometimes when things are reduced, we appreciate them more.
Yeah. Well, that idea, Rich, that, you know, nature really is everywhere. And, while we do need more nature in our urban centers, and there are inequities in access to, some of the, the, the most healthy spaces, but we can start from a place of abundance and recognizing that, that nature really is everywhere. So,
This also has to do with the trauma that probably among survivors will be delayed. And that part of that trauma will be in some people will be fear of nature. So in a way, only nature can heal that fear. So we're gonna have to focus on that, I think, in the months ahead.
Absolutely. All right. Well, let's thank you, Jennifer, and let's go to the next question. Hi, Molly Stevens. What research should we be doing now and in the immediate future to support the growing support for outdoor play and learning? Um, I'm going to take a first crack at this, and then Rich, I'll let you give your thoughts. But one of the things, Molly, actually, I was talking to someone yesterday who was saying, is anyone doing research, even kind of public opinion polling about all of this connection to the people are kind of turning to the outdoors right now in unprecedented ways, and in some cases almost problematic ways. Parks are having to shut down because people aren't they're flocking there, and they're not practicing the social distancing and the physical distancing that we're being asked to do. And so I think that actually would be very interesting right now, is to start to capture some of that public opinion. Like, why are you going outdoors? What are you seeking while you do that? How do you anticipate continuing that connection? Beyond the crisis? How is this having you appreciate your parks more than you used to? Those kinds of questions. And so I think we may actually try and do some of that public opinion polling through our networks, just to start capturing some of that data. I think it could be very beneficial for us to understand really how people are thinking about it and how that might impact how we respond later. But I don't know, Rich, what other thoughts do you have about the research that should be being
Well, one area of research that needs a lot of attention, I learned this when I was working on wild calling, is we know a lot about how, it's relative. We know some about how domestic animals, how help with mental health and physical health. That dogs get us out to walk them, and people who have dogs tend to be healthier. Um, and a lot of other research that's shown the power of animal assisted therapy, which is a fast growing area, but it uses domestic animals, uses horses and particularly dogs. And it's a wonderful area that's expanding with service dogs. There are some abuses of that, but it's growing in a good way, mainly. What we don't know is about how wild animals affect our mental health when we encounter them. That coyote that walks through the backyard and stops and makes eye contact with us. What does that do to us? I have theories that I present from the many stories that I collected for the book uh, that are pretty profound stories, I think. But in terms of science, we've really not looked at that very much. We've looked at wild animals, more as objects, as something to study that's beyond ourselves, that's separate from ourselves. But what about that relationship? What about that, what I call the habitat of the heart that exists between us and another animal? When we have that encounter, even if it's only for a few seconds, something changes in us. What is that? Why is that so important to so many of the people that sent me their stories?
right.
And how can we have more of that?
Mm-hmm. It's good thought. I hope folks are adding into the chat your thoughts and answers to that question as well. I think we'd love to crowdsource some ideas on things that people think we need to know more about. It'd be really helpful for us to know that. Okay, do we have another question? I love that the need for nature is being recognized right now as people try to get outdoors and connect to the world. What are your recommendations for keeping this momentum going when normalcy starts to return after COVID-19? This is from Katie E. Um, yeah, it's a great question, Katie. Um, I think, I don't know, Rich, do you have some initial thoughts to that question? Would you like to take a crack at that one?
I was looking at comments over there and questions. Um, I think keeping the momentum going when normalcy, that great invented word from, I think it was one of the presidents in the 20s, starts to return after COVID-19. I think the momentum has to be created now. It all depends on how we take this moment of great consciousness about the importance of nature, ironically, even as it's removed from us in many ways.
Mhm.
That progress depends on what we do right now, the momentum and we're just beginning to think about this. So that's why we need so many ideas from the programs and parents and teachers and pediatricians on what do we do now to make sure that when the slingshot is let loose, that that the target is hit in a really good way.
Right.
That metaphor, I'm not sure works completely.
Well, one of the things I guess I would add is just, ask this question, can the organizations and the individuals, represented on this webinar and beyond in our networks, is there a way that we can start to focus, more on our collective power than our individual organizations and missions? Can, now that we're not able to provide direct service programs, is there a little more time to come together and say, how do we advance our movement together and pool resources for service delivery and fundraising? And, really that idea, the idea of building that bigger boat, is this a moment to do that? And would that help to keep the momentum going? Can we find, is this a moment to find, partnership and solidarity with other institutions? So, our places of worship, schools, libraries, those, finding creative partnerships between conservation organizations and youth development organizations. Can we reach out now to, you know, um, the health field, the social service field, youth development, to bring, rather than asking people to come to nature, we bring our story and resources and ideas to communities. Um, so, I think that those are just, some ideas of how we might use this time to be more to be creative and to support each other in really building that bigger constituency.
Somebody just mentioned, or there's several comments about making sure we address the backlash, the ecophobia, as David Sobel calls it. For example, fear of bats, where the virus originated, apparently. That needs to be part of keeping nature front and center. Uh, that's going to be a tough one to deal with because that fear is going to be there and it will be misused. It will be taken advantage of by some people who really, don't like conservation, don't like all this nature talk. So we're going to have to deal with that. I mean, part of the way to deal with that is to support the One Health movement in public health, which really does see all of this holistically, that you can't treat or prevent illness in people unless you do the same with the animals that they're around and the earth itself, that the health is interwoven in that way. Another way to make thing that we need to make sure people understand is one of the reasons, apparently, for some of these novel viruses is because we've taken biodiversity away, that biodiversity itself is a protection against this kind of uh, uh, these kind of novel viruses that come out of an abnormal natural setting. Uh, and that's a complex issue. It's going to be difficult to communicate, but it's one we're going to have to grapple with. And again, anyone out there that has suggestions on how to do that, scientists, et cetera, we'd love to hear from you and share those ideas with others.
And I would say that it seems like there does seem to be at least a little movement right now of sort of recognizing that we do need scientists and we should be listening to them a little bit more. So that may be a little bit of a silver lining right now, that folks might be listening to that, to the scientific community on how we should be responding. So that
One of the things in doing that is, in order to grow the movement, not only the Children in Nature movement, but the New Nature movement, the environmental movement, is to not rely solely on data,
right,
not
of
rely solely on
course,
science. The great Australian philosopher, eco-philosopher Glenn Albrecht, after the fires in Australia, she saw all of those wonderful people who had lost their houses rushing into the fire to bring water and food to koalas and other animals. It was deeply moving.
yeah, that's very
And this has to be, he points out that the social movements that have made the fastest progress are not the ones that made their argument almost entirely on data, on
right,
science. That's important, but they're the ones that made it their argument based on relationships,
right,
based on love. And he actually uses that word. Our love of these animals around us, our love of the life around us. We can't lose track of that, as we talk about the data. And to an extent, the argument about climate change has become, it needs to broaden. In addition to more data, we need to focus more on our love of the life around us.
exactly. That's a really great point. Well, we've got about 4 minutes left. Let's do one more quick question and quick answer, if we can. Oh, hi, Amy Sandine. Amy's question is, those of us on the call tend to live, breathe, sleep, or not, right? Not much sleep these days, and eat this passion for finding answers and solutions. How do we best engage our volunteers, students, participants, and board to be advocates and positive voices for connections to nature? Oh, good. Thanks for throwing this one with a quick answer, Amy. I hope people in the chat will put their thoughts and ideas in there. But I do think one thing I would say, I hope that some of the resources that we've been collecting from across the movement in FindingNature.org might have some ideas in there that you can share with people that might get them motivated. I think again, Rich, I would say, the storytelling that you talked about. I mean, I think this is a time to share our own stories with folks and ask them to do the same. I don't know. I mean, what other ideas do you have about how we, for those that aren't as immersed in it as we are, how do we encourage them to be engaged at this time?
I think it's a great question, and it's the puzzle we've been dealing with for quite a while. I think part of the answer is, as we talk about physical distancing, is in social solidarity,
Mm,
of reaching beyond our silos, you know, of reaching beyond our professions, reaching beyond our political beliefs even. There's something about the children in nature issue that brings people together who don't usually want to be in the same room. Well, now that we can't be in the same room, we have to do that in different ways. That solidarity with the other people who care perhaps as much about the connection to nature as we do, and perhaps not, but to really see all of them as allies. One of the, and this is probably the last thing I want to say, that this piece I wrote for REI, it ends with a quote from a friend of ours, Suze Lipman, who was a writer with Children Nature Network quite a few years ago. And it's a wonderful thing. She talked about how in Italy, people would sit on their balconies and sing to each other across this from building to building, and that this was taken up by people in Chicago and Dallas who followed that example. And she talked about how in California, where she lives in Mill Valley, they now have the Mill Valley Howl. And she says the howl, as she calls it, has grown to a citywide cry at 8 p.m. each night when cooped up residents open their windows to go out on their front yards, decks, and streets and howl at one another into the twilight. And she says the howl suits this place at the edge of the wilderness. From my house, she says, the howl seems to start low in the valley and swell and run through the neighborhoods and canyons and up into the hills. And she says the howl is the call of social animals. Howling lets others know distinctly, I am here and I see and hear you. We're here in our houses. We're here on the planet. We're with one another, alone and together. So now, as I end that article, now and after the virus fades, don't mourn, plant. Don't withdraw from the world, persist, and sing the wild calling.
Well, Rich, I don't think we could end on a better note than that. Thank you, everyone, for being with us today, and keep being in contact. Keep letting us know how we can be of support, and be well. Thank you. Bye.